Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Mason Arts at Home, the Earth Day edition. When the world changed about a month ago or so, a little bit more than a month now, and so much of our public ability to gather was taken away, suspended temporarily in the interest of public health and safety, we at George Mason University's College of Visual and Performing Arts thought, how can we help do what we do? How can we continue to create community, which is our mission? How can we keep our performing souls alive and our visual art souls alive and our filmic souls alive? How can we serve our community without access to the screens and the studios and the exhibition halls and the theaters where we do our work? So we came up with this thing called Mason Arts at Home. And before I go any further, I want to give a big shout out to Adrian Godwin and Haley Smizer, who are the members of the CVPA staff most directly responsible for programming this great series. It's a wide-ranging series of events, some conversations like this, some screenings of pre-existing work that we're reviving and contextualizing, and some brand new work that's being created just for Mason Arts at Home. So we are thrilled tonight to be celebrating the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which is a monumental paradigm-shifting event in the history of the world, I think, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on, with a very, very special event, a great conversation with a terrific friend and colleague of ours, the actress Kaiulani Lee, who has been a member of the George Mason University School of Theater faculty for more than 25 years, teaching acting for us. She is a distinguished performer on Broadway, off Broadway. She's the holder of an Obie Award. She's been in feature films, on TV. She's been the subject of a whole Bill Moyers special. She's worked in regional theater, and it's my privilege to have known her and actually have worked with her in another production, which we'll talk about later. She wrote and performed a play based on the life and works of Rachel Carson, the author of Silent Spring, which, when it was published in 1962, was a revolutionary work. It was one of the sparks that led to the creation of the environmental movement that we know today. And really, without connecting too many dots, it led to the creation of the first Earth Day in 1970. Kaiulani's with us tonight, and I'd like to bring her into the studio, if I may, to say hello, Kaiulani.
Hello, Rick.
We are so grateful for your time and your lifetime of artistry that created this work, A Sense of Wonder. And just to sort of set the table for our viewing audience, we're going to play a short trailer from the film. And before we do that, I want to emphasize that this work was created as a play for the stage and performed many, many, many times, probably hundreds of times before it was filmed. But you did make a film of it, and the film has its own beautiful dynamic, and we'll just get a taste of that with this trailer. So let's go ahead and play the trailer, and then we'll come back and talk about the whole thing.
Okay. I couldn't find a magazine that would publish it. Well, if a magazine article couldn't be published due to advertising restraints, then a book would be written.
I knew that if I were to write honestly about chemical contamination, I would be plunging myself into a sort of war with the chemical industry.
Her book is more poisonous than the pesticides she condemns. Women didn't go to college in 1926 to major in biology.
I was a biologist by day and a writer by night.
I thought that I had abandoned my writing for science. But it was the study of science that was making my literary career possible.
Rob? A child's world is fresh. It's new, it's beautiful, full of wonder and excitement. It's our misfortune that for most of us, that clear-eyed vision, that true instinct for what is beautiful and awe-inspiring is dimmed.
People always comment with surprise that these books of science should have such a large popular appeal. But the notion that science is something that belongs in a separate compartment, apart from everyday life, is one I challenge. The book actually offended a relatively small segment of our society, but a very rich one.
Hundreds of thousands of dollars have been spent attempting to discredit not only the book, but the hysterical woman who wrote it.
Of course, the attacks are not pleasant. They don't really get to me. We'd all been made so well aware of the benefits of these pest controls. But why had no one alerted us to their potential dangers?
We use them in our kitchens. We rub them on our skin.
We coat our lawns, our gardens with lethal sprays and dusts.
And every meal we eat carries its load of chlorinated hydrocarbons, DDT, other related chemicals.
The question I asked is so simple. Is it possible to lay down this barrage of poison on the surface of the earth without making the earth unfit for all life?
Again, that
was painful. It was out of sync.
Yeah, yeah, that's our internet these days. But I watched this film again this afternoon after having seen it a few years ago and having seen the play a little bit longer ago than that. And even this little trailer just brings back such a rich texture of her life and your embodiment of that story. And I have to ask, there's a line that I don't think is in the trailer, but is very important in the play and in the film, where Rachel Carson says to us, the subject chooses the writer, because she was on a literary path of indeterminate direction, but then she became a scientist, and her work in science actually led her to do the writing that was most impactful and that really made her career. So the subject chooses the writer. You were and are a performer doing all these plays and films and TV shows, and yet suddenly in the middle of all this, you choose to become a writer and create a sense of wonder. How did that happen?
Well, unlike Carson, who always wanted to be a writer and became a scientist, I never wanted to be a writer, but nature has always been my home, my God, my safe place. It's where I understand things, where I go for reflection, for beauty, for peace. And my husband became an environmental attorney, and he changed careers. So it was late in his life, midlife, and he came home with the first stories of climate change and genetic engineering. And I was shocked that in our highly technological society, we were now able to change the world as I knew it. And Carson had spoke in her journals about her wake-up call was the nuclear bomb. And she had not realized that we could change the world or destroy it even. And she realized she had to do more than watch the birds and plant in her garden. I had a similar mini wake-up call, Kaiulani size. And I thought, I can no longer just take care of my own. I have to do something to defend. It's going to take the energy of all of us who need and depend and feel a part of the natural world to defend this onslaught of using it just for profit. And so at first, I tried lots of things, Rick, before I thought of writing a play. I started busing children out to the Shenandoah Mountains from elementary schools. And my husband turned to me and he said, "You're not a bus driver. You're not a science teacher. Why don't you use your craft?" And I went back to Carson. I knew her, but I knew of her. I'd read some of her books. I'd never read Silent Spring. I started a comprehensive reading of everything. And I found she articulated my heart. And I thought, here is what needs to be written about. But I still didn't plan on writing it. I wasn't a writer. And so I went to New York and spoke to all my writer friends, many of whom you know. And they said, really good idea, but we have things we want to write about. That we'll put that on the bottom of our list. And I ran into Wally Shawn, who is a wonderful actor and was a friend. And he said, wow, if you do anything about Carson, you've got to talk to my dad. And I said, fat chance. His father, of course, was William
Mr. Shawn,
yes, the editor of the New Yorker magazine. And Wally knew me well enough to know that I would not call his father like he told me to. So he had his father call me. And Mr. Shawn said, when are you in New York? And I said, well, I'm doing a play. I'm commuting. I'm there Tuesday through Sunday. And he said, how about we meet between your matinee and evening show Wednesday at the Algonquin? And I went, oh, okay. And he was so generous. And anyway, to make a very long story a little shorter, he so believed in the idea. And I said, could you help me find a playwright? Because you know everybody in England as well as here. And he said, yes, well, let's keep talking. And we talked for months. And then he called me one night and he said, I've got your playwright. And I said, oh, can I use your name? It's gold. Anybody will fall down if they, and he said, you won't need to, dear. It's you.
Oh,
and I went, oh, but I don't know how to write. I've never written anything. And he said, no, that's a psychological block, not a writer's block. You quit working on Brian Friel's The Aristocrats and start writing, and I'll edit. This is really important. And you've got the energy, you've got the knowledge, you've got the passion. Go for it. And I gave 2 weeks notice.
Wow.
And started writing.
And that's an amazing story. It resonates with Rachel Carson's own story that she tells in the play about how she wanted to she discovered the subject and wanted other people to write it, and went to scientists and went to writers, went to E.B. White, who of course was also associated with Mr. Shawn, and his name comes up. That's an amazing bit of resonance there. And let me just put on my old professor hat for a moment and say that for the younger viewers right now who may not know Mr. Shawn, he was the editor of the New Yorker for how many decades, and really made that magazine, and was considered to be the best editor in the world. And so to have him invest that spark in the genesis of this play really means.
Well, he said when he threw down that gauntlet, there was no way I could back off. Right. I just thought, okay, I'll give it a try, And but the other thing you should know about Mr. Shawn is he had never serialized anything, and the very first book he serialized in the New Yorker was The Sea Around Us, and he fell in love with Carson as a writer, and he just adored her. So he, as well as everybody else, tried to talk her out of writing Silent Spring because they knew it was a death sentence. They said, you have such a rich literary career ahead of you. You will be destroyed by coming up against the chemical company.
But then he published it, right? He published
He did. Yes, right after. Houghton Mifflin, the other man who stood, these two men as pillars, William Shawn and Paul Brooks, who was her editor and publisher at Houghton Mifflin. And he had just finished his biography of her. And he, after one weekend of talking, he trusted me. I have no idea what these men saw in me. I'm not being shy here, but why he said, wait a minute, open your station wagon. And he put in boxes, maybe 13 cartons of her letters, her diaries, everything before it went to the Beinecke Rare Book Library. And I said, Mr. Brooks, I'm a really slow reader. When do you want this all back? And he said, when you're done.
Wow.
So I drove off with all of this original material, and both these men.
That's like lightning striking twice. That's amazing.
And with those two men behind me, everybody came in to help. The estate opened their doors. The Rachel Carson Council opened their doors. Stuart Udall said, come to Arizona. Everybody who knew her and had been a big player in her life. And so that started 3 years of research.
Which, again, strangely parallels the 3 years of research that it took her to write Silent Spring. Wow, that's just amazing resonances. Let's talk a little bit about Rachel Carson herself and what you discovered about her in digging so deeply into her private letters and her published writings.
Yeah. Well, I knew I did not want to. I ended up with a notebook of things that had to be in the play. And of course, it would have been, 30-hour play. And I had no idea how I was going to organize it. But the things that surprised me, I had her on such a pedestal. And there were things like I thought, whoa, she sure complains about headaches and not feeling well at night. And, whiny. And I thought, and then I had interviews with her housekeeper and her personal secretary, and they talk about what she was under with radiation, and that she had iritis, and that she had heart palpitation, and how sick she was. And I go, oops, didn't get it. And then I worried about her relationship to her adopted son. But by the time I met him, Roger, he said, we had a great relationship. Huh. She was wonderful. I said, but she always worried that she didn't take you to movies, and she wasn't like a good mom. And he said, she was a magnificent mom. It was just a different kind of mom. So I had to bring her down off this pedestal and to hear the intimate stories of her laughter, of her, she loved to write. She wrote, anybody who wrote her a letter, she responded. Oh, if only we knew. And she had many, many dear female friends, and they would just giggle on the phone at night before she went to bed. And one of my favorite pictures of her is a picture of her at a bar with Jimmy Durante. Huh. And Carson, who's quite simple in everything, has lost all her hair from the radiation and the cancer. And she's really, she doesn't want anybody to know she's sick. So she bought this enormous Elizabeth Arden wig. And she has on flaming red fingernail polish. And she's sitting in a bar, and Jimmy Durante's going, And I just thought, it's not what I thought of as this saint of nature, you know? Oh. There were so many little twists and turns like that.
Oh, that's true. I want to pause here just for a moment and let our audience know that we are soliciting questions and comments on the Facebook live stream. And I have a veritable army of producers monitoring that who will relay questions in. So anytime, we'll start taking those a little bit later, but I just wanted to let everybody know that you are welcome to ask questions about Rachel Carson, about DDT, about Kaiulani Lee. Anything is fair game. So speaking of DDT, because 1962, right? So I'm some small number of years old in 1962, and I'm growing up in Wisconsin, where we had mosquitoes, of course, as everybody does, and there was a citywide spraying program. Right. And my mother was sort of onto this, and she ran through the house screaming every time she saw the flashing lights and heard the noise of the sprayer come by, and slammed the window shut and said, "Get away from the windows." And that was very sort of early.
Good for her. We ran around in it, going waving at the planes.
I mean, it's terrifying to think what was being sprayed from trucks and from the sky and put into the water. Can you talk a little bit about from your point of view?
I'm sorry. I was going to go ahead. A tiny piece of historical context for our student age. After World War II, 1945, the chemical companies had made hundreds of new chemicals for wartime use. And when the war was over, they had them all, and they didn't know what to do with them. And they said if they kill, mites and stuff on soldiers, if they can deforest this and that, let's use them. And so they brought them back without any testing for agricultural use. And the Department of Agriculture and the chemical companies started using them. And there was no restraint, and there was never any testing, and it started to cause havoc. So by early 50s, you were starting to see signs, but they were all not relatable. I mean, there was something sprayed for fire ants, or there was something sprayed for fish. There was something, there were problems all over the country, and nobody had connected the dots. And that's what she was able to do.
There's a beautiful passage in the play and the film about robins, where she goes through the sort of the life cycle, really the death cycle, of how the spraying for one thing ends up causing the next season the death of the robins who eat the worms, who ate the leaves, who, it really instantly makes clear how unintended consequences. You're trying to solve a problem, and you unintentionally create a myriad of other problems. And this idea of connecting the dots, I think, is really profound in the show, in the play, because it seems to be that that's what she's always doing. She's always putting.
Well, her main message, if there's one thing that audiences I want to leave the play with, is she was the first one to articulate for us the interconnectedness of all life. And that little story about the robins is a page and a half in her book, Silent Spring. But another interesting thing for our students is she had no computer. She couldn't do the research or write people and get all of these stories from, and I followed her notes for that. It took her 2.5 years to get that page and a half to write to the head of Michigan State, and he was on sabbatical and was really his graduate student, blah, 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 blah. But it took her years to get that information, which is mind-boggling to us today.
And can you talk a little bit to us, as you do in the play, about the way she was vilified after Silent Spring? She knew she would be. She knew she would be going in. Part of the reason it took a while to write it, but the reaction was, at least in part, really harsh.
The reaction was brutal, which is why everybody, including William Shawn, begged her not to write it. They knew whoever did it, and she knew it, but she didn't know it would be so rough. And so what she did to prepare herself for it, I encourage you all to read her books and read Silent Spring. The last fifth of the book is footnotes. Every single thing is so carefully footnoted from every scientist, every field expert, every doctor, so just after the first article came out in the New Yorker, there was a lawsuit by the six major chemical companies in this country sued her and sued Houghton Mifflin to stop the publication of the book. They wanted no more than this first chapter. And Houghton Mifflin freaked out and said, "This will destroy our company. These are the most powerful," because don't forget, the chemical companies were subsidiaries of the oil companies. So this was a really big part of American capitalism. Yeah. These were the powerhouses. And Houghton Mifflin said, "We can't do this." And they said, "What are you going to do?" And she said, "I'm going to meet him in court. The facts are all accurate." And Houghton Mifflin was so shocked that they said, "Okay, we'll go to court if you're really certain." And she said, No, put off publishing for a year. I'll go. And they said, "No, well, if you're that confident." And she said, "I am completely confident." So they went to court, and the chemical companies did not show up. And the book was published in September, and from the day it was published, they hired spokespersons to go on radio shows across the country to put her down. They called her a spinster. Why would an old woman who couldn't have children because she wasn't married worry about the future? She's neurotic. She's emotional. She's just interested in sort of the airy-fairy parts of nature. She talks about the balance of nature. There's nothing scientific about her. They got large newspapers and large things like Time magazine. They published in every major. So it was a tiny fraction of society that had this reaction, but they were very rich and very powerful, and they really tried to bury her. And she didn't even respond.
Huh. And power and money, of course, create access to all the media platforms of the time, which were not as widespread or pervasive as now, but arguably more influential case by case. So if a mainstream editorial, or she mentions Newsweek in the play, how that, a very sort of middle of the road publication, you would think, reliable, opinion.
Yeah, no, it was, and then, it was very, very strong, but simultaneously, Udall, who was head of Secretary of the Interior, read it, and he took it to Kennedy, John Kennedy, who was president, and he said, "You need to read this." And there's a lot of scientists who say she is absolutely right. And so Kennedy read it, and he did an interview about it, or he did an interview about something else, and the press just pressed him on this. And he said, "I think Miss Carson it sounds very accurate, and we're going to start congressional hearings on this." And her congressional testimony was so powerful that within 10 years, so the book came out in 1962, the congressional testimony and everything happened in 1963, and she dies in early spring in 1964. And within 10 years of her death, because of her congressional testimony, we have the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Environmental Protection Agency, and every single environmental law that we have today came out of Silent Spring and that testimony. So that's why the chemical companies were fighting so hard. It was the first regulation ever in this country for the environment.
And that's astonishing. If anybody is ever tempted to say that a work of literature or a work of the imagination can't change the world, this is proof to the contrary. Now it's not fiction, but it's a literary work written with beauty and strength, and written by a writer who was herself a scientist. I mean, I wanted to make sure we mentioned that as well. Yeah. She had a substantial academic training as a scientist, and then a career as a scientist as well. And I know that career, factors into her work. Tell us a little bit about that part of her life. Fish and wildlife.
She wanted to be a writer, and when she was in college, she was forced to take a science class. She took a biology class and fell in love with it.
Oh, those liberal arts requirements.
And as she says in her journals, I thought I had given up my literary career for science, but it was science who opened up my literary career. While she was one of two women at Fish and Wildlife at the Department of the Interior. She was so lucky to get a job. They told her when she was becoming a scientist, just in her undergrad, before she did graduate school, that the only work she could possibly get was an elementary school teacher as a female scientist. She didn't care. She said, I really like this stuff. I want to keep learning it. So she was honored to get this job at Fish and Wildlife. And they asked her, because they saw how beautiful her writing was, to write the copy for everything that went out. And she wrote this piece that became Under the Sea Wind, her first book. And the head of Fish and Wildlife read it and said, this won't work. This is awful. I mean, you have got to start again. But as he left, he said, but please send this off to the Atlantic because it's brilliant. It's just not government stuff. And so she sent it off. It got written. They took it, and then her first book offer, and then her second book offer. And but she stayed at Fish and Wildlife because she had so many family responsibilities. Her parents she was very, very poor. She grew up in Pennsylvania, right outside Pittsburgh. And they had no running water, no electricity. I mean, poor family. They sold her their china to keep her in clothes. She was on full scholarship at Chatham College, and then she got scholarship to Johns Hopkins for graduate. But her father became ill. Her parents moved in with her in her little apartment in Baltimore. And then her sister got ill and moved in with her 2 children. And then her father dies, her sister dies. She's got her mother and these 2 nieces, and they grow up. One has a baby. She ends up with raising the baby, which is her adopted son. She took care of 4 generations of family and had no personal private life. She worked, she supported them all. She went to work, and she came home and wrote after she got home.
Well, here is a question from the great world beyond that actually relates directly to her private life. Her relationship with Dorothy Freeman. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Dorothy Freeman was her next door neighbor in Maine. And Dorothy Freeman was married with children, and I got to meet those children and grandchildren and all the research. And there's been always a question of how close they were. Rachel was incredibly close with her mother. They adored one another, but Rachel depended on her. And when her mother died, Dorothy, in all the interviews I did, which was lots of people who were on the front line, including the family and the housekeeper and the secretary, and they said that Dorothy always wanted to be a writer, and so she was learning from Carson, and Carson had been so dependent on her mother as a support system, someone to read her stuff to, everything, and Dorothy became that. And there was nothing that I found about a Boston relationship, but there was, once I started performing the play, that came up, and I thought, who cares? Dorothy was happily married. If there was something special bond between these 2 women, they didn't live together. Carson lived in Maryland in the winter. They lived in different states. They were, but they offered each other enormous solace and comfort, and they were dear. She was her best friend.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's so interesting because Rachel Carson's personal life has this big hole in it, and I think imaginatively we want to fill it.
Well, it starts though, she didn't have a hole when she was in college. Before she went to graduate school, I have this journal entries of her being at Chatham College, trying to figure out her friends helping her dress for a prom, for a party, and her dates, and and it was full of girlish excitement. And but by the time she inherited her parents, she was only 22, and from then on she had no social life.
Yeah.
She didn't go to a movie or a concert or a trip. She worked and took care of people.
So we just have a couple minutes left, or I should say just a few minutes left because the time has flown. But I want to, first of all, invite any other questions out there about Rachel, about the environmental movement, about Kaiulani and this process. I have a couple more myself, but I want to make sure that we attend to our listening audience. I also want to let everybody know that the film, A Sense of Wonder, is available by special arrangement for free streaming for the next couple of days until the 23rd. And the link to that with the password, it's a password protected site, is available on our Facebook page here, and it'll be in the comment thread somewhere if it isn't already. So make sure that you spend the hour or 55 minutes with Rachel. It will absolutely repay your investment of time and this with this amazing performer that we have with us tonight. So I want to sort of close on, or maybe not close, but sort of move toward closing on a question of process with this play, because you've done it now for almost 30 years. Is that right?
I started in 91. Yeah.
So that's getting on literally almost 30 years. Literally hundreds, if not thousands, of performances all over the world, not just
all over the world, the whole world.
From the standpoint of a fellow traveler in the theater, but not that well traveled. What has changed for you as Rachel Carson and as Kaiulani performing?
A beautiful question, because I was a grown-up when I wrote this play. I'd had a wonderful career. I was married. I had 2 children. My life seemed full, but I was still a little girl. When I found Carson, I found my voice. She articulated my heart, and by learning to write the play and then performing it night after night, I internalized. I grew up. I found who I was, and I owe all that to her. My husband, many people used to talk about, you should start the play with Silent Spring, and she's like Saint Joan, and she accomplishes so much. And I said, no. I don't want to let the audience off the hook.
Yeah.
She's every person. The reason I call it a sense of wonder is because it was her sense of wonder, her love for this beauty and the majesty and the creatures of the natural world that sustained her. That's what gave her the courage to fight these battles. She wrote, one of her last journal entries was, if I don't do this, before she wrote Silent Spring, if I don't do this, if I don't take this on, I will not be able to face the next spring, knowing that I have the power to alter this. I can try to shift, the trajectory of where we're going. I have the information. I have the clout, and so she changed my life, and the play stays fresh every night. I mean, who the heck does a play for 30 years?
Yeah.
The play stays fresh because the audience is the second character, and whatever the audience brings to me, plus the growth of my own personal life, changes it. But it's different every night.
Yeah.
It's the same words. And there's some horrible mistakes in the play. I mean, just writing errors and that. But I would no more open this document and try to tighten it up again. It was so hard to close.
It's an amazing. So there's another. I'm going to give one more question that came in, and it's a lovely final thought opportunity. But just again to reflect on the parallel between your story and Rachel's in a way, because that sense of mission and that sense of purpose, and as I've come to know you and work with you over the years, you are an artist and an activist wrapped up into one, and you have a sense of mission every time you step on a stage, and that resonates so strongly with why we do this work. Okay, so that's the play. Now the film that we saw a little bit of and that we are touting for audience viewing here in the next couple days. The final question we'll talk about tonight is, what is your favorite part of the movie version of A Sense of Wonder? Having done the play thousands of times, here's this fixed document that was carefully...
There's no question. I have a very favorite.
Okay, terrific.
It's the last minute and a half.
Yes.
And Haskell Wexler, who was the fabulous cinematographer, he was... I was doing the part just prior to that, and I saw tears coming down his cheek. And I turned and said the last speech to him. And so it was sort of by accident between the chemistry of the two of us.
Yeah.
But that speech, which, by the way, which is her last public speech she gave, but she wrote it, I will forget which year, but like in her early 20s or 18. She almost verbatim. And again, I track that with my life. The things that you believe most deeply travel with you. And when she was trying to figure out what to say after she'd won all these awards just before she died, that was in the center of her speech. And it was something from her journals from when she was like 18.
That's so amazing. And the very last words, I think, if I remember, are that's all I want to say.
Well, that was my added to get them all.
Fantastic. Yeah.
But it was the speech about beauty and and the meaning of it all, and that anyway, that if you don't see the film, just tune in for the last 3 minutes. It says so much.
Stunning. And there's something I'm staring at a couple of notes that I wrote for myself, and I'm appalled that I didn't mention this at the beginning. But again, this is not a bad way to end. You mentioned awards that Rachel Carson won. One award of yours I didn't mention, which is the most important one in the context, is the 2014 Rachel Carson Award, which I remember the moment you found out about that.
I was doing Mother Jones.
Yes. What an amazing honor after all those years to be recognized with that signature honor. And I'll close on that, but I just want you, if you wouldn't mind, just reflect on that for a few seconds, and then we'll say a graceful goodnight.
Well, it was an honor, but I would love to close with a couple of quotes from her that couldn't go in the play.
Even better.
Or if we don't have time for those,
we do.
I would say, please read her books. The play is beautiful.
We would love to hear you.
But read her books.
Yes.
That's where it all came from.
If you have a legal pad handy with some,
yes, I do, with some
words
of quotes.
Yes.
And her, if you are not a good reader or you like to walk, I recorded her books for Books on Tape. Silent Spring is not a difficult book. It has science in it, but she's such a poet. And you can just listen to me, read it to you, and you can go on a walk.
That's a deal.
Okay. So here's 2 or 3 quotes. We still talk in terms of conquest. We still haven't become mature enough to think of ourselves as only a tiny part of a vast and incredible universe. Man's attitude toward nature is today critically important simply because we now have acquired the fateful power to alter and destroy it. But man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. I think we're challenged, as mankind has never been challenged before, to prove our maturity and mastery not of nature, but of ourselves. And she wrote about climate disruption. I mean, this is also applicable. And I have 2 more things I have to say really fast.
Yep.
One is, for students out there, I want you to be empowered. This was a woman who was poor, who was sick her whole life, took care of all these people, who had no old boy network, worked through college just like all of you do. And she changed the course of history. And in her journal, she had a quote by Margaret Mead that said, we each have the ability to make a creative difference in this world. And she lived by that quote. But the last decade of her life, she changed it. And she said, we each have the responsibility to make, and that was when she became an activist. So I want you to know that you do have the power, and she beat the chemical industry. She beat the Department of Agriculture. She did it all by herself. She had nobody on her side. So as we face climate change and these big things, you do have much more power if you follow your heart than you think. And because I think that our job today is to reinvent our whole relationship to the natural world. For you to go out and to fall in love with nature because you will defend that which you love. That's what I want you to do, and that's what I know she wanted you to do.
And that's a magnificent way to end this Earth Day celebration. Kaiulani Lee, what a privilege and an honor and, of course, a pleasure to be with you tonight. Thank you all for listening and watching and for your questions and comments. And be sure to click on that stream of A Sense of Wonder. You will not regret it. And I'm going to go out and download the audiobook. Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us on Mason Arts at Home.
Thank you.